Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Political Vigilante FNX Boardroom edition. There's a really good column in Truthdig from Chris Hedges entitled "The Cult of Violence Always Kills the Left," and he mentions this in Death of the Liberal Class, and he mentions it in many other places, and it's worth talking about because his concern is historically when people on the left start protesting and some of those protesters become violent, it actually undermines what the protest is about. And so some of the people who in Antifa and the Black Bloc really want violence. They want to go punch a Nazi in the face, which I understand the emotion behind that. I'd like to punch a Nazi in the face. But in terms of a wider, broad strategy that we need for peaceful resistance, I don't think it fits. And here's a great example that he gives. He talks to, right in here, the anarchist Andy Cornell makes a distinction between activism and organizing. He said, activism is about self-expression. It is often a substitute for strategy. Strategic organizing is about results. These acts of self-expression, which is what Antifa does and what we did in the Weather Underground, are exactly what the cops want. The slogan diversity of tactics used by the Black Bloc and Antifa is ridiculous, he said. Even the term tactic is ridiculous. What we need is a strategy. And let's be clear, even when you adopt a nonviolent strategy, it will be portrayed by the state as violent, right? That's what they always do. Anything, Black Lives Matter, Ferguson, anything like that, they try to make it violent to give, because if they get even a sliver of violence, if you have 1,000 people protesting and 2 of them are violent, 2 people are violent, they're going to say violent protest and the cops were justified, they had to. That's how they do it. I mean, look at how the militarized police, unarmed men, of all men, women, of any ethnicity, are getting gunned down. This is what else he says. This is what the Israelis are doing at the Gaza fence. I often tell the Antifa kids here, there are about 4 Antifa kids in Albuquerque, and they hate my guts. I tell them this story. There was a spontaneous anti-war demonstration in 2003 by 1,000 people in Albuquerque the night the Iraq War began. The cops, who support the military, were angry. They attacked the crowd with tear gas and clubs. There were a lot of arrests. The victims brought a civil suit against the police. It did not come to trial until 2011, okay? The police in the city of Albuquerque were the defendants. They were charged with violating the rights of the protesters. It was a jury trial. The jury found for the cops. Why? They brought in photos of a couple people with bandanas covering their faces, and they said these people were terrorists. There was a photo, 200 to 300 people in the photograph. In the front were 2 people, 2 out of 250, 300 people wearing bandanas. So less than 1% of the people in the photo. They zoomed in on the people wearing the bandanas. They told the jury, see these people wearing bandanas? They're wearing bandanas because they're terrorists, and we knew they were about to attack us, so we had to attack them. And the jury went for it. So he's saying don't wear bandanas. It's why I have a problem sometimes going to rallies and protests, because all it takes is a handful of lunatics. And sometimes those lunatics are paid by the CIA to stir things up. I know people that were at the '68 Democratic Convention, people that I knew in Chicago, who were older than me, and they were like, in their late teens or early 20s in 1968, and they said, oh, the CIA went down there to start riots against the cops, so the cops were justified. All it takes in a peaceful rally is just a handful of knuckleheads, and then it becomes violent. And I understand emotionally I remember at the inauguration, and the Antifa people, they smashed banks and they smashed, and I'm like, okay, I get that frustration. Believe me, the bank stole my house. They took the banking industry, fueled by Bush and Obama, helped take my house. That's why I'm an independent. That's why I won't support the Democratic Party in any stretch of the imagination. The Republicans have always been pretty evil. But he said, and so a lot of people were like, oh, look what they, so I understand the frustration, and I've had that emotion of like, oh, I want to burn these banks to the ground, but it doesn't work. He talks about, too, what had happened in the occupation of Columbia University in 1968. And the strategy had its roots in the organizing techniques of the labor and civil rights movements. The means of transmission were red diaper babies, referring to as sons and daughters and members of the United States Communist Party. The red diaper babies at Columbia, SDS kept saying, build the base, build the base, build the base. It became a mantra for years. It was all we could think about. That meant education, confrontation, and talking. It meant building relationships and alliances. It meant don't go too far out in front. In the spring of '68, it all came to a head. And in 1968, they said it was time for us to strike. They said Columbia was a success. The deed attracted attention. And because of the alliance with the black students, which has never gotten enough media attention in the story of Columbia, we closed down the university. The reason it didn't get attention because the media needs to keep blacks and whites and Latinos, we need to keep us all divided. If we all get together, that's not good. They need us divided. Which is why they've tried to portray Black Lives Matter as a violent group to keep white kids scared to joining with them. We accomplished our strategic aim, which was to politicize more people and to build the movement. Our goal was not to end the university's involvement with military research. This happened at a lot of campuses during the Vietnam War. They would protest any universities that were doing military research. And I've told this story before, but I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and before I was born, my mom tells the story. She was it was in a play. My dad was a theater professor. And, she saw kids getting beat up and rioted and stuff like that. And radicals from the left blew up the math building because the math building was doing research for the war in Vietnam. And their plan was, we're going to do it at night when no one's there just to make a point. They didn't realize there was a grad student in there studying. He got killed. They killed somebody, an innocent person. And they felt justified with that. So that's the context of this Columbia story, is in that context. So that was happening a lot on college campuses, going back to this Columbia story. The real goal was to build the movement. I got into a lot of trouble for saying the issue is not the issue. But Rudd, he said, and other radicals soon became, he said, enamored with the propaganda of the deed. Self-expression replaced strategy. The organizing, which had made the occupation of the university successful, was replaced by revolutionary posturing. The radicals believed the more radical tactics, including violence, would accelerate political and social change. It did the opposite. After Columbia, the SDS, as they talked about here, it was failure after failure after failure in SDS for the next year and a half, he said. Then we doubled down on the failures. The SDS radicals came under the spell of revolutionary theories propagated by those supporting armed liberation movements in the developing world. They wanted to transplant Franz Fanon's call for revolutionary violence, Lin Bao's idea of a people's war, and Ernesto Che Guevara's FOCO, or Insurrectionary Center, to the struggle in the United States. That's why when I always see Che Guevara, was always like, I've seen him on shirts and like, oh, I've seen people wear his shirts at peace rallies. And I'm like, Che Guevara ended up being a hitman for Castro. And this is the fear of, like, Antifa, throw a brick through the window. The radicals would go underground and carry out acts of violence that would ignite a national war of liberation. This call to arms was seductive and exhilarating, but it was based on distorted and highly selective account of revolutionary struggle, especially in Cuba. Che put forward a phony analysis of how the Cuban Revolution was won, Root said. According to him, it was won solely by Fidel and Che going into the Sierra Maestra mountain range. Armed struggle was the only thing that was important to the Cuban Revolution. All other aspects of the revolution, including the 20,000 people who were murdered by Batista, the dictator in the cities, the national strikes by the unions, the street protests by women, university students, and the Cuban Communist Party were wiped out of history. There was only one thing for us to do: pick up the gun. The cult of the gun was disastrous. It distorted reality. It elevated violence as the only real tool for revolution. Vijay Prashad, in his book The Darker Nation, spells out the incalculable damage caused by this cult, including the doomed attempt in 1967 by Che Guevara to form a FACO in Bolivia, an effort that would cost him his life. The cult of the gun saw most third world liberation movements, such as the National Liberation Front in Algeria, devolve into squalid military dictatorships when they took power. My little segment of the left worshipped Che, Rudd said. We believed in the propaganda of the deed. We were so sure of our strategy, of leading the armed struggle, that we decided to destroy SDS and build the Weather Underground, a revolutionary fighting force. We decided on a tactic which was to bring thousands of people to Chicago in 1969 for the conspiracy trial of such radicals as Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, and Tom Hayden, charged with instigating riots in the '68 Democratic Convention that I talked about. Very few people showed up. We got creamed with beatings, arrests, and even shootings by the cops. After that, we went from bad organizing to no organizing, Rudd said. It was purely about self-expression. That self-expression would take the form of bombs. The first thing we did was kill three of our own people. Premature explosion of a bomb in New York City townhouse, March 6, 1970. That killed 3 of Rudd's comrades, sobered the radical group. The Weather Underground bombed buildings that symbolize centers of power, including the Pentagon, the Capitol, California Attorney General's office. Yeah, this was all part of that. And this is why I say this before, and as pissed off as I get, I understand the rage about this, and I understand about let's burn it all down, but this is, they talk about it, the seduction of the gun. Because once you get that gun and that power and you start committing violence, violence begets more violence. There's a quote, in violence we lose ourselves. I think it's either Gandhi or maybe it's Dr. King, I forget. But that's true. And then you're justified for it. And then it becomes, in America, it's all about me, 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 me anyway. So then the goal of the overall resistance or the let's change for the greater good becomes about, look at me, I'm a revolutionary, and I'm going to go blow things up. And so we're at a very critical point here. As I've said, we need more resistance. We need more walkouts. We need more strikes. What the teachers' strikes are doing in all of these red states is really powerful. Uniting labor. What the March for Our Life kids are doing, it's important, and they need to do it not on weekends and not during Christmas or summer or spring break. But if it turns into a violent thing, it's going to get awful. And learn from these guys. Learn from these people that did this in the 60s and they thought they were so justified. And they killed their own people and ruined lives, and things fell apart. And this is what he says at the end. I can't communicate with Antifa because my own PTSD forbids me to say you are so morally right, so courageous, and so morally pure, Rudd said. You understand how violent the system is. You understand what it is like to be non-white. I understand your motives. I applaud you for it. This is the only thing they hear, words that feed their self-adulation. I'm a veteran of all this shit, he lamented, but that doesn't count for anything. It's all expired. It's a great article. Read the whole thing. And it's stuff to think about because we talk about it a lot on this show, and what we can do individually and what we can do together to bring about change. And I know it seems like a very big mountain, and sometimes it's pretty depressing. But violent revolution won't be the solution. It'll be awful civil war. And it'll ruin lives. And people that you love and care about will be killed. And it's not good. Peaceful, nonviolent resistance. That's what we need. Thank you for supporting the show. Make sure you subscribe. YouTube has been unsubscribing people. Please go to the Patreon page. I need your support. I got to get over $1,000 a month to keep this thing going. Thank you so much.